Hi, how are you? Hello, I see you. I'm just gonna. I can't, but I know I got to in person.
Starting next week.
Okay, I'm sorry, what's her name again?
Hopefully by summer, we'll be back. Lots of tours.
I really enjoy being able to do online.
I will
Say that to my cousin over there.
I thought you two knew each other.
No, we never met.
That's why you got confused the other day when I said, hey, I ran into the ADA gal at the coffee shop. You're like,
I was like, huh? Okay. So I was like,
I think Mama Jarma, she's sitting there. Well, she probably want to be down the center.
Drop something.
how you doing?
Good.
Good to see you. All right. So usual.
Talk about things every day. And I got these cool little black and yellow stripy socks. They really tie it together.
Oh, I saw those. Oh, you see those? Yeah, I saw those. I actually.
Oh, these? What size is it?
Yeah, probably in the front, probably a 9.
I got you.
Probably 9.
Yeah, I'll,
See, like the first one, usually 10.
oh,
Maybe. You know.
yeah, I'll, give me a week or two. Money's a little tight for the state, but I'll get a pair and I'll have them up at the shop. Gotcha. Well, yeah, but, you know, the seed is that the other thing is send them back. Because they don't, I got these back in Minnesota and I called like, companies, and so I was like, hey, you got all these stuff perfect stripes? They're like, what the hell are you talking about? So, what's it? Oh, yeah. And, like, the companies.
I know.
And you can without the socks.
Okay. Happy Sunday, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Detroit. I'm Christine Peel. I am the co-chair of the Visiting Author Series for the Detroit Public Library. And today we're glad to present to you all a presentation from the Black Violent Archives and the Detroit Sound Conservancy. And they are hosting a panel discussion about the impacts of the freeway systems on Detroit communities, especially Black violence. So let's get started.
All right, okay, thank you very much, Christine. Okay, I'm Michelle McKinney, Mama Jara, or Jara McKinney, however you want to call me. And we're here today with my cohort, Black Bottom Archives is Marcia Black. And so we're gonna go ahead and get started. We have a wonderful panel for you. And we're gonna introduce everybody, and it's really gonna be a discussion, because after a while, we're gonna talk about what are we gonna do about it. That's how I feel about it. So it's displacement and preservation. And so we're losing, or things are at risk. They're being lost, our culture, our heritage here in Detroit. And so we're going to be speaking about that. Should I add anything else?
I think that's good.
Yeah, because we have been, United Sound System is one of our flagship things that we are working on, raising awareness about this here in this area. I think that if the Detroit Sound Conservancy had not been coming to these meetings of the city had and talking to the media and raising people's awareness about it, it would not be standing today. And unfortunately, I was just talking to Jason, a young man who came in today. There's a lot of places in Detroit like that, like Phelps Lounge. There's no entity that is there to help preserve our places. And that's one of the things that Detroit Sound Conservancy is interested in. It's one of our 4 cornerstones that we built this music archives, music and sound archives on, is that we have to do placemaking and place keeping. And this is really gotta come from you all, because if we don't do it, who's gonna do it? Who's gonna tell our stories? So this is what we are doing here today, to help be raising awareness about this. And we have a wonderful partner in Black Bottom Archives, because that was one of the areas that got raised for the I-375. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Black Bottom Archives.
Yes.
This is Marcia Black.
So yes, I'm Marcia. I'm the director of Black Bottom Archives. And I guess, thank you. So yeah, just a little bit about Black Bottom and our organization. So Black Bottom, the one that we talk about, the version that we talk about the most is as it being a historically Black community, and one of the key settlement places for Black people who were migrating during Great Migration. So thinking about the city at the time where redlining and racial segregation was limiting Black people's access to different spaces in the city, Black Bottom served as a haven for people to have Black businesses, Black entertainment, Black cultural centers, so churches, schools. So it's significant that this community was destroyed and displaced and replaced with I-75 and I-375. And I think, so these are some pictures. Mama Jara offered some from the Adler collection, which was a Black family that did documentation of communities throughout Black Bottom. And then there's also some pictures of Hastings Street here, and then in the corner is a picture of the area where currently we're in discussion about what does it look like to redevelop I-375, and the state and the city and developers are in conversation right now about what the boulevard could look like. And so a part of that discussion is that there's an opportunity for us to talk about how to repair and use this to have some reflection about what happened to Black Bottom, and also take some action to move differently now that we understand the lessons and how impactful it was to displace a Black community in this way. So that's a part of what we also want to be able to discuss with y'all in this time is we believe that storytelling and preservation has a role in how we think about repairing communities. And so we want to be in deeper discussion about that. And yeah, thanks y'all for coming. I'm gonna just do some introductions for our amazing panelists that we have today. So we are joined by Baba Jaman Jordan, the official City of Detroit historian, the first ever. We're also joined by Janice Hazel, who's most recently been, oops, my mic is going up. Okay. Hey, Renard, you can hop on. Who most recently joined the Reparations Task Force, which has an important role in how we're thinking about reparations today. And then we're also going to be joined by, oh, maybe I'm too far. Okay. We're also going to be joined by Marcia Music, who's father owned a record shop there. She's also a cultural worker in Detroit. I'll share a little bit more in detail because they also contributed their own bios. And then we'll be joined by Renard Mashowski, who's an organizer with the Detroit People's Platform. So a little bit more in detail, starting with Marsha Music. So she's a daughter of pre-Motown Detroit, record producer, is a writer, poet, storyteller, and consultant, writing acclaimed essays, poems, and narratives. She was born in Detroit and raised in Highland Park and has lived in these two cities all of her life. In her early years, she spent much time around her father's record shops on Hastings Street before it moved in 1960 due to the construction of I-375 freeway, and then at his 12th Street store before its demise after the '67 rebellion. In her teens, she was a student activist and later a labor union president, followed by 30 years with the Wayne County courts. Through it all, she has been a writer, contributing to numerous oral histories and over a dozen literary anthologies and films, including on HBO, PBS, Amazon Prime, and the History Channel. Miss Music was the recipient of a Kresge Literary Arts Fellowship in 2012 and was a 2015 Knight Arts Challenge awardee. She has performed her acclaimed one-woman shows and poetry on many Detroit stages, including the Detroit Symphony. In 2020, Miss Music was hailed for her narration of the acclaimed opera Twilight Gods at Detroit Opera. Her late husband, celebrated artist David Philpott, passed away in 2018, and in 2019, she published her inaugural book, The Detroitist. Today, she is co-producing a documentary about her father's life and times, Hastings Street Blues, with filmmaker Juanita Anderson. She lives in the Palmer Park apartment district and appears on the Advanced Style series of fashion books and social media, noted for her distinctive style. So if we can give an applause and a welcome to Ms. Marsha Music. Second,
Second, we have Renard Mashowski. Mashansky, say it again.
Mashowski.
There you are. He's been an organizer with the Detroit People's Platform since 2014, starting as a volunteer canvasser for the Community Benefits Agreement campaign, which sought equity and benefits for communities experiencing the threat of displacement due to publicly funded development. His work in transit justice organizing began in late 2015, where bus riders were experiencing long wait times, lack of reliable bus service, and experienced being stranded several times. His mentor, Linda Campbell, and other organizers in Detroit inspired him to organize for transit justice and has made relationships through his on-the-ground outreach and connection with bus riders experiencing inadequate and unreliable public transportation access. Renard has been a bus rider for over 15 years and has lived in Detroit since 1994. He grew up in a single father household along with his sister, attended Detroit Public Schools, earned his diploma from David McKenzie High School. He is ethnically West African from the Mende Creole people, the First Nations, the Cherokee Nation and Anishinaabe, and Lithuanian Polish. So this is a little UN right here. Renard is a first-generation college student and a proud alumnus of the University of Michigan, class of 2011, and earned a bachelor's degree in sociology, involved in various social campaigns throughout his youth, first learning organizing when his Detroit high school was slated for permanent closure. He has been involved in several campaigns to overturn Citizens United in Colorado, the Raise Michigan campaign, to raise the minimum wage, and is a dedicated supporter of the Affordable Care Act and Medicare for All. Currently, Renard facilitates a leadership volunteer group named Transit Justice Team, which regularly engages with bus riders, the Detroit Department of Transportation, and typically meets twice a week, where they learn leadership development, organizing, popular education, and policy advocacy. He's also involved with the Earned Sick Leave and One Fair Wage campaigns, and is a 2015 Economic Justice Alliance of Michigan alumnus. He continues to live in Detroit, organizing for racial justice, equity, and transit justice. Thank you.
And third, we have Ms. Janice Hazel, Janice is a native of Detroit, is a national thought leader whose experience spans government, broadcasting, entertainment, and nonprofit sectors. She has been a senior staffer in Congress, advising members of Congress, including Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, U.S. Senator Donald W. Regal Jr., and Congressman John Conyers Jr. An influential arts advocate, she has held nationally impactful positions in government agencies and influential trade associations as a lobbyist for America's Public Television Stations Trade Association, representing the nation's 350 public television stations and radio NPR. It's securing $2.45 billion for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting from federal appropriations for 7 years. Mixing her nonprofit management, advocacy, and production skills, Ms. Hazel served as executive director and executive producer for the Rhythm and Blues Foundation, spearheading royalty reform for music makers and raising millions of dollars for healthcare and housing for indigent recording artists. In that role, she administered programs including the Let the Good Times Roll radio series airing on over 100 public radio stations across the country, and emergency financial assistance grant programs for recording artists. She produced award shows during Grammy Week festivities in New York and Los Angeles. A lobbyist for artists' rights, her efforts went toward raising funds to provide financial assistance and health care to artists who recorded between the 1940s and 1960s, who did not receive royalties, insurance, or other forms of compensation for their recordings. She also managed the Rhythm and Blues Archive, a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution, Broadcast Music Incorporated, the National Endowment for the Arts, National Public Radio, and Indiana University. Janice is deeply committed to public and community broadcasting and has served as a director of development and communications for Howard University Television, raising millions of dollars for the operation of the nation's only Black-owned PBS station. Her belief in public and community broadcasting led her to serve as chairman of the local station board for WPFW-FM in Washington, D.C., and corporate secretary for the Pacifica Foundation, with oversight of the Pacifica Network's 5 radio stations. She also served on the board of directors for the Public Access Corporation of D.C., a membership-based, non-commercial, public access television network. She is a multi-platform journalist, including a staff writer for the Michigan Chronicle and political analyst for PBS stations, BET Network, WURD 96.1 FM, Philadelphia, and an executive producer for shows on 910 AM, WFDF Detroit. She attended Cass Tech University and has a BA in political science from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and studied French at l'Institut de Touraine in Tours, France. So, yes, let's welcome Ms. Janice Hazel. And last but not least, we have Baba Jaman Jordan, who is a public intellectual who has been serving residents and visitors for decades. He founded Black Scroll Network in 2013, and his tours help long-term residents, visitors, and newcomers alike to understand the history of the city and role Black and Indigenous people played in its development. He is the City of Detroit historian, and before he was the city's official historian, he taught history at the Inseroma Institute in Detroit for 12 years, one of the city's now closed African-centered schools. African-centered schools or Afrocentric schools teach every subject from the perspective of African descendants rather than the Western way that most U.S. schools do. Baba Jaman can now be found teaching at the University of Michigan's College of Literature, Science, and the Arts Semester in Detroit program. He has a course From the Underground to Motown, a course on Detroit's history, which focuses on the city's cultural transformation during the 19th and 20th centuries. He also serves on Michigan's Freedom Trail Commission, which preserves the state anti-slavery history. So a big welcome to all our panelists. And so yes, we're gonna hop right in with our first question, which is, what happens when our stories are not told and what is lost?
Would anybody from the panel like to start first?
So many of us know what happens when these stories don't get told, because many of us grew up and we didn't know that there was a such thing as Black Bottom. And if we knew about Black Bottom, we may not have known where it was. And if we knew where it was, we didn't know that there was a business strip that was just outside of it. So a business strip that ran through it and extended outside of it in a business community known as Paradise Valley. So there are people who grew up in the city of Detroit and never knew this. And when they come to the city of Detroit, particularly if they go downtown today, they see all of the development that has happened in the last few years. So when I was growing up, much of what you see in downtown Detroit was abandoned. So many of those buildings were blighted, or closed, and were abandoned. And so if you go down there now and you see all the development that's happening, you say, wow, Detroit has really changed. It's really gotten better. And if you're missing this other history, when there was a Black business district that will be located technically in what is now part of downtown, you would think that African Americans came to the city of Detroit and ended up becoming the majority, but never created a business center for themselves. And that the only development that has ever happened in the city of Detroit, particularly in the downtown area, has been from 2 or 3 billionaires who have created a fiefdom in downtown Detroit. So if you don't know that history, you think that, well, Black folks never did nothing with it. They never told, but you don't know this other history that's missing. It has been not only wiped off the map, but wiped out of our consciousness. And so you don't know that there were 350 Black-owned businesses from the 1920s to the 1950s, and that these businesses were concentrated in the Lower East Side of the city of Detroit, just north of Black Bottom. So the area that's now occupied by Ford Field, Comerica Park, 36th District Court, the freeway, 75, which was Hastings Street, and that whole area. And then it would end up growing outside of that area, but that was the beginning of the area known as Paradise Valley. And you have businesses, restaurants, clubs, bars, theaters, grocery stores, liquor stores, candy shops, clothing stores, all the things that the people in Black Bottom would need. So they weren't catching the bus to malls in the 1920s and 30s. They were going in their own community, walking right outside, crossing Gratiot from Black Bottom and going into Paradise Valley and getting all the things that they need. Not only were the residents of Black Bottom doing this, but white folks who weren't outside of Black Bottom were coming into Paradise Valley and going to those clubs, those restaurants, those theaters where the big band performers were performing. Because of course, big band from the 1920s up until about World War II is pop music. That's the popular music of that day. So Duke Ellington was the Beyonce of the 1920s and 30s. And so everybody likes that music, not just Black folks. And so everybody's going to go wherever that music is being played, wherever those performances are happening. So these African Americans are really running this. And this is destroyed. Not only is it destroyed from the map, it's destroyed from our consciousness. When we talk about big band jazz today, when we talk about the swing era, we talk about New Orleans. Of course, we ought to. We might talk about St. Louis. We might talk about Chicago and New York. We skip over Detroit. Detroit is known for one music mainly, and it's Motown. But you don't have a Motown without Paradise Valley. You don't have the musicians that can perform for the Motown artists. That's what the Funk Brothers are. They're big band folks. That's who they come out of big band, or they're trained by people who come out of big band. And so that whole history has been wiped out. And when I talk to people today, they are totally unaware that Detroit has this history. And it's partially because of omission. We just didn't know it, so we can't teach what we don't know. That's part of it. Part of it is purposeful. The other part is you purposely are not supposed to know that this ever happened. All right? I want to be clear about that. You are purposely not supposed to know this happened. Now, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the Tulsa Race Massacre happened in 1921, you know, Black Wall Street, the schools, the Tulsa State Educational Department kept the whole story of Tulsa, the Oklahoma State Department of Education kept the whole story of Tulsa out of the curriculum of Oklahoma for almost 100 years, almost 100 years, about 96 years, they kept it out of it. So you could grow up in Tulsa, in the neighborhood, where everything happened and never have heard anything about it in your school unless your teacher was just an activist teacher and made sure that they taught it even though it wasn't in the curriculum.
5 generations.
That's right. And so that's the same thing what happened in the city of Detroit. So when the last building got destroyed in 1999 for the building of Comerica Park, so most of Paradise Valley was destroyed in the building of the I-375 and I-75 freeway. But there was little spots that were still existing. One of them was the 606 Horseshoe Lounge. It's the last to get destroyed. It gets destroyed with the building of the Comerica Park. I'm sorry, Ford Field. But all of that was being built at the same time. So it was all part of the arena project. The owners, still African Americans, said, we want to be a part of this. We want to be a part of this new development. Understand, Comerica Park and Ford Field were paid for by taxpayer dollars. Let's be clear, we're not talking about, they weren't asking Henry Ford's family to pay for this to be a part of this development. They weren't asking the Illiches to be a part of paying for this. They were asking for them to be a part of taxpayers because they were taxpayers. They had owned that property for decades. So they were property taxpayers. They were saying, can some of this property taxes that are being used to build these big arenas refurbish our club and we can begin doing the same things we were doing in Paradise Valley? Jazz, performers, and have a museum for Paradise Valley. Of course, the families that are running the arena said, no, we don't want that there. And so it got destroyed. I mean, it was bought. So the arena program, project bought the land, or they would have been forced out by eminent domain. But they purchased it, and they were nice enough to put a historical marker there. So when you walk out of Ford Field and go into the Ford Field Park, there's a historical marker for Paradise Valley, a front and back marker paid for by the Ford family. I mean, they footed $4,000 for the marker. Oh, great. And that's what you get. However, if you try to go to that marker, I do tours in the city of Detroit. I bring groups there. You try to go to that marker, the first people who will tell you to move along are the security for the Ford Field. They don't, so it's there, but you're not supposed to know that's there. So it's a historical marker there, but you're supposed to see that as you walking out of Ford Field on your own playing football. You're never supposed to bring a group there to learn all this history. So, of course, I'm the official historian for the city of Detroit. So now when they do that, there's a problem. But when I first was just leading tours, I was thrown out of that area a whole bunch. I mean, they would call the police. They would do all kinds of stuff to keep me from being there. But so it's purposeful that you're not supposed to know this history. That's the point I'm making. Part of it is we don't know it, so we can't teach it. But the other part is you purposely are never supposed to know about a lot of stuff that happened. And so just as they're purposeful in trying to keep this history from us, we have to be purposeful and intentional in making sure the story gets told.
Hi, so I'm going to build on what my esteemed colleague here on the panel just said. And so if you can recall some of the touch points of my background, I'm not sure, can you hear? No, it's not. I don't think it's on. Is it on? Okay. Okay. Yeah, that might work. I think that hurt. Okay. So I'm a native of Detroit, and I was downtown for 4 years, Cass Technical High School. And Renard, I appreciate your work because I graduated in the class of 1981. That's 41 years ago, and I'm still waiting for the Joy Road bus.
Stop it.
Okay? Still waiting for the Joy Road bus. That life was hard, I'm telling you. Joy Road, you could get the Grand River, but you had to get to Grand River. Okay? So I appreciate your work. And I want to just briefly throw out something. Everyone in the room knows who Carter G. Woodson is. Okay, he's known as the father of Black History Month. He was a noted author, publisher, editor, historian, born in 1875 to enslaved parents. He died in 1950. And I want to reflect on what Carter G. Woodson famously said. He said, if a race has no history, it has no worthwhile tradition. It becomes a negligible factor in the thought of the world, and it stands in danger of being exterminated, right? Isn't that what John just said? Right, okay. So a lot of what I have done in the federal realm working in Congress is writing legislation to preserve history and to preserve Black history in particular. I hope to write legislation, appropriating legislation. That's the legislation that you need in order to let Congress spend money on things, right? And so for over 30 years, many of us were fighting to get the Smithsonian, the National Museum of Black History and Culture, which after 30 years, we were able to get the land appropriated on the National Mall. Because the Smithsonian is not one institution, it's many institutions. And it is now there. So if you haven't, I hope that you get a chance to take your children, nieces, nephews, all the children in your life to the National History of Black Culture, because it's phenomenal. And it has a wing dedicated to music, right? Now, I grew up in Detroit, and my brand of music is funk, because funk is its own reward, right? And United Sound System is there to preserve United Sound System Studios, because one of my cousins I'm very indebted to was an original member of Parliament Funkadelic, Eddie Hazel, who was a guitarist. And so I had the great opportunity as a child and as a youth. My first concert was at the age of 5 at a Funkadelic concert, right?
That's
So
a
I've been
funk baby right there,
funketeer.
if I ever heard.
Been a funketeer all my life.
You a funketeer.
Absolutely. But I was able to go to the studio and actually sit in on some of these sessions for Flashlight, right? So all of those things, types of things, most of George Clinton's productions were at United Sound.
That's right.
Bootsy Collins' performance, his albums were recorded there, and many other before Motown. And I absolutely love Motown. I've worked with Mr. Gordy, with Suzanne DePass. She is a mentor of mine. So is Mrs. Esther Gordy Edwards, the founder of Motown, a mentor of mine. And I've raised money for the Motown Museum. But before Motown, Mr. Gordy bought those buildings on West Grand Boulevard, he recorded at United Sound System Studios, right? So it needs to be preserved. And that's one of the things that Detroit Sound Conservancy does. And we need to be very clear. Right now, the Michigan Department of Transportation wants to demolish that studio because they own it now, or possibly move it. But the studio is in the basement, so you can't move the foundation up out of it. So you have to be very clear of remembering and keeping spaces where people recorded. And for us, I will say as a Black American, some major music. Isaac Hayes recorded Hot Buttered Soul there. Aretha Franklin recorded Zoom there. John Lee Hooker recorded there, right? I've worked with John Lee Hooker before he died. So those are some things that we have to remember. And over in Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, I have relatives whose homes were destroyed. They're no longer with us now, but they lived over there, okay? And so by eminent domain, the city took that land and then moved them further west, but you know, that's destabilizing when you are removed from your home. Your children, now have to go to different schools, etc. So in my focus in my career has been saving Black history spaces. So the Smithsonian Museum of African American History is one. I want to say something that Lonnie Bunch, who is the president of the Smithsonian Black History Museum, he said, "It is easy to be written out of history when you are not present," right? So when people die and there are no oral histories, nothing written, then it becomes a revisionist history for whoever remains. Or you can be written out of history. And that's what is happening with Black American history, and that's what's happening with Black American culture, and the accomplishments and the gains are not being documented. Therefore, it is easy for other entities in the scenario, this case, white Americans, to say that, well, Black people haven't accomplished anything. That's what you said, right? So that's the president of the Smithsonian's African American History Museum. So as Marcia mentioned, Marcia, I'm sorry.
It's Marcia.
Marcia Black said, I just was confirmed by the Detroit City Council on our reparations task force last week. But before that, going back 3 decades, back in 1989, I helped to write the first reparations bill in Congress for Congressman John Conyers. Thank you. And so we have 34 years trying to get that passed to repair, address, and acknowledge the atrocities and the inhumane treatment of descendants of enslaved people. So we have to always be knowledgeable of how to advocate for ourselves and lobby for ourselves and our spaces and our history and our culture. Because if not, it gets written by someone else and things get left out, or it's revised, or it's not done at all. There's a wonderful Detroiter, Jonathan Harrison, who has done a phenomenal image, a painting. Jonathan Harris. A wonderful painting that if you haven't seen it, Google, see it. He's being exhibited in Detroit right now. But his image went viral in 2020 after the George Floyd murder. And it's pretty much an image of various ancestors, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, but it has a white male's arm rolling a paintbrush over it, right? It's a very, very powerful piece, so I hope you get a chance to see it. But also, as you mentioned, the legacy of music, and I have focused on jazz. I wrote the first appropriating language for the Smithsonian's touring jazz orchestra. Why is that important? Because jazz is an indigenous music art form in the United States. Why was it important in 1990 to get the US Congress to acknowledge that so they could provide funds to the Smithsonian and to other institutions for jazz education programs, right? So now you have jazz education programs at universities around the country, okay? So those are the types of things we have to be very focused on saving our spaces and our culture. And we as Black Americans pay taxes, our parents did, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. And for me, my great-great-grandparents, just 4 generations, were enslaved people. So they had wage theft. So they paid their taxes, right? And we need to be very, very cognizant of our culture. And I'm always here to help.
And it's really funny, thank you, just give her a hand. You rolled right into our next question that we were asking the panel about the government and how the government, what can government institutions do to rebuild trust and repair harm that's done to displaced communities? And one of those things is you have to use the government. What we here in this area, we had that reparations bill that was built into the last vote we did. And so that's one, shows you the power of the people in getting this even to the point where the government can work on it. So that's one of the things. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, definitely want to. Hi there, Renard, him with Detroit People's Platform. You've already alluded to the answer almost. I'm really glad that the segue happened. It's about, when you said lobby the people, it's organizing those impacted, and it's about using those stories to create a framework or a strategy to create justice out of this injustice that's happened. And let's remind all of us that a freeway was built in our community to wipe out a thriving Black neighborhood and community. It's just to erase it. It was an intentional act, not only throughout all the United States, but Detroit as well too. Baltimore, I'm thinking of so many other cities and examples of that. So an organizing strategy is very important with that. And it's about having cultural institutions. It's about having those individuals with lived memories. I organized with someone. He's a senior citizen. He's a bus rider. I had a memory of him in the area watching movies as a child. And then that's what's at stake here. We organize for majority Black Detroit and racial justice, right? For transit, for housing, for equitable development, for this very reason.
Say the name of the organization again?
Detroit People's Platform.
Detroit People's Platform.
So, and the reason we do, because we are at risk of physically being erased from the city today with gentrification, with high rental prices going on. So we're talking about, the memory of Black Bottom. It's actively happening today, right now, through certain policies, through inequitable development, through downtown billionaires running the show. So the stories are central to creating that organizing strategy. It's about building alliances and strategies with neighborhood individuals, with community groups, with cultural institutions that are holding those stories as well too. And the thing is about, we're unashamed of saying we organize for majority Black Detroit because we have people that have those memories of a thriving community here, of bustling neighborhoods, jobs, pride in the work that we do here as well. So it is, this regression has happened over these past decades where we're going back to old patterns, where the United States is starting to look like the 1950s again, right? So it's really crucial and incumbent upon us to organize. When I say organize, that means building power. It means getting researching about Black Bottom, the harm that was done. It's about getting census records. It's about documenting that impact with the stories so we can build strategy, which the tactics inform that strategy. And the tactics, one of them are ensuring that those stories are centered. The thing that we have to prevent is another plaque. We are not a plaque. We're not a memory. We still exist. And that's what happens. If you erase the memory of majority Black Detroit thriving, then you can, there's a reason why our neighborhoods are being gentrified and priced out right now. Because if you don't value the history of someone, if you don't know the history of someone, then you erase them. You don't see their humanity. And that's what's at stake here. People do not see the humanity of majority Black Detroit because they don't know our history. And it's not even the history. History is political. The stories are not political. The stories are what held in memory and mind and heart.
Thank you. And that's one reason why it's really incumbent upon all of us to become archivists, to know the stories that our families and communities created and lived. So you need to get the word out, and you need to take that action too, to actually contribute to archives, to come to things like this, to create voice type things like this where we can talk and discuss some of those stories. How many of you have lived in a historic neighborhood? You feel that you lived in a historic neighborhood here? Okay, yes, you do. In fact, everybody's hand should be up because all of us have come. A lot of immigrants came here through Black Bottom the same way. And so archives are an important way to keep the story going and also education. I wanted to hear a little more from Marcia Music to talk about some of the stories that your family lived through, and talk about how bustling it was and your father's record shop. Wasn't it like that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. This subject is very wide-ranging. There are no simple answers to this very complex set of circumstances. Get one. Thank you. Y'all don't mind. I want to say something. Most people, well, I'm making a presumption. Many people in this audience are perhaps not organizers. Many of you are regular people going about your regular, everyday life. What are some of the things that you can do to deal with this situation that we have on the erasure of history? When I began to write about my father's record shop, I began because my father, growing up with him, I had known that he was a record shop owner. And I had known that he was a major player in Detroit music. Even as a baby girl, I knew that my dad was the man. You know, he was a man on Hastings Street. It was no joke. However, my father suffered several reversals in his career. One of the first ones was the elimination of his record store because of the building of the I-75 freeway. That was a major reversal. Now, he was able to move, along with other business owners, to 12th Street. In between that time, after his move to 12th Street in 1960, when I was about 6 years old, many of you have seen a photograph of me standing in the doorway of my father's record shop with my hand on my heart.
Black woman.
And then my backbone split.
That's right.
Like we used to say back in the day. Now I was standing in the doorway of the record shop probably months before the store had to move in 1960. My father became very ill after the move to 12th Street. He became so ill, no one knew what was wrong with him. He was very ill, gravely ill, unto death. And eventually, he was diagnosed with something called Addison's disease, which was virtually unheard of, except for the fact that President John Kennedy, who was president at the time, also had Addison's disease. And his doctor, he finally found a doctor that was aware of this affliction and prescribed him a miracle drug. My father was dying. A miracle drug that had never been used in the area very rarely, and it's called cortisone, which is something very common today. You can even find it in a basic nose spray today when you have sinus problems. And his life was saved miraculously. However, he also became afflicted with alcoholism. And so I believe that the trauma of having had to move from his very successful record store. Let me tell you about my dad. My father was the first to record Aretha Franklin's voice. In effect, you might say he discovered her. She was singing in her father's her father's church. She is depicted in two major films. One was on with Jennifer Hudson, the other with Cynthia Erivo, and both of those places, those films recreated my father's record store in the film. They did that because of the work that I have done to restore my father's name to the public domain. And in that, I have been assisted by innumerable music scholars, music people in the blues forums, the Detroit Sound Conservancy, who have also aided and abetted me in this effort to return my father's name to the glory that it deserves for what he did. Because it wasn't just about Aretha Franklin. My father is the one who took John Lee Hooker to United Sounds to record him. And innumerable other artists, blues artists, gospel artists. And you might say that he was an architect of the Detroit Sound. He preceded Berry Gordy by over 15 years. Berry Gordy used to come into the record shop in order to talk to my daddy and ask him about how could he get a record. He brought some of his first equipment from my father. So my father was very seminal in the development of Detroit's music. Some even go so far to say, and I have heard it said by scholars such as John Sinclair, and others, that they believe that he really was a part of the architect of rock and roll itself because of his early records like the Hucklebuck and other instrumental songs. That's an oxymoron. You can't have an instrumental song. Instrumental music. At any rate, I just wanted to throw that in there about my daddy. So he was a very significant player in Detroit on Hastings Street. And Hastings Street was a bustling, crowded place that everyone congregated in. Hastings Street was not the only place where Blacks lived. Black Bottom was not the only place. And Black people could live in other areas of the city, but in very tight enclaves, such as Coney Gardens, such as what we call the Old West Side, which is around the Boulevard, Dexter Boulevard, you know, in that area, by Henry Ford Hospital. The further west side where my mother grew up, the ABC streets, American, Brighton, and Central. Those are streets were near Tyerman and Livernois. There was an enclave of Black people that lived there in a mainly Polish and Lithuanian neighborhood. They all went to Chadsey. I have sinus issues, not that other thing. And so I'm just trying to give you this overview because a lot of the reason why I became involved in sharing my father's story is that due to his alcoholism, he died in relative obscurity. He was no longer a big-time man on Hastings Street, particularly after he was in 12th Street. He was beginning to disintegrate. He was dying of alcoholism. And his reputation was shot. He was no longer recording to the same degree. And he died when he was about 50, in his mid-50s, and I was 19 years old. And after that, I was very embittered because I had grown up a child of an alcoholic, because I didn't grow up in the glamour of the music business after he became sick. That changed to the hell of growing up with an active, insane alcoholic, which my father was. And after he died, I would get people that would talk to me, and they would say, I'd see him in the grocery store in Lafayette Park, Frantic Ernie Durham, a famous DJ. He would say to me, you know, I'd run into him in the grocery store and I'd say, hello, Mr. Durham, I remember you. And he'd say, ask me my name, and I'd tell him I was the daughter of Joe Von Batten. And he'd say, you better write a book about your dad. He was a great man. He changed music in Detroit. And I would have others that would say such a thing. One of the things that I became dedicated to was returning my father's name to the public domain. And in that process, I realized that I had forgiven my father for the trauma in which I grew up that was caused by a great deal by his alcoholism. And also to have those memories of him return to me, those great memories of growing up in the music business, which I did. And but one of the most important things is that the importance of narrative. I became passionate. You could say obsessed, but I'll say passionate about the importance of narrative. Narrative is another way of saying stories. The stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell one another in Detroit and outside of Detroit about the city. And they are vignettes or snapshots of reality in Detroit. One of the narratives is, well, Black Bottom was just a slum. That's why they destroyed it.
Right.
And it is the little truth of that that is expanded to create a lie. Because by the time Black Bottom had been neglected for decades, not invested in, not developed, it was not the Black Bottom of the early days when the doctors and the lawyers lived there. It was another Black Bottom. And so therefore, people feel justified in its destruction. Narratives mean that when they say Detroit was empty, you hear people say that. Detroit was empty in the 90s. It was empty. You could see prairie dust rolling down the street in Detroit. It was empty. Well, one of the things I have learned through experience is that the narrative of Detroit being empty is a form of erasure. Because what it is saying is that it really was empty of white people. Right. Because those are the only people who matter.
That's right. Yep.
And so when you talk about Detroit was empty, you don't count Olayami Dabbles of Mbad Bead Museum, now on Grand River. You don't count the fact that he was in the David Whitney building with a thriving art center. You don't count Dr. Cleety Taylor, who had extended arts gallery. Arts Extended Gallery in the David Whitney building. You don't count Dale Pryor, who had a absolutely fabulous gallery, a legendary gallery in Harmony Park.
And she supported a lot of jazz musicians in there too. She'd have musicians come in and play.
It was
the program.
It was jazz, arts, and antiques in Dale Pryor's gallery. It was a real center of culture. She was basically kind of run out of there in the interest of gentrifying that neighborhood.
That's right.
And Dale Pryor's gallery, and this happened almost 20 years ago, and it is empty to this day.
That's right.
They didn't even do nothing with it. They got her out of there.
Nothing, just got her out.
That's right.
And so I'm telling you about narrative and how important that is.
That's right.
Pat Archer, a wonderful artist who does work with furniture. She had a gallery down in Harmony Park area where near Spectacles now. There's so many artists. Modell, international designer, had a shop. Joey Coelho, now in New York, had a wonderful place in Town. These people had a burgeoning Black entrepreneurial spirit and artistic centers in this so-called empty Detroit. This Detroit that was empty. And the reason why I'm telling you this is that sometimes the things that you can do as just a person, not an activist, you're not marching, you're just a person. When someone says, and you know, like a person from out of town or a suburbanite that moved away, and they say, aren't you glad Detroit's coming back? Well, you can say, you know, Detroit never left. You did.
That's right.
You see? Because it is in these kinds of ways that the reality of what happened here is erased. When you accuse the very entity that didn't leave as having left, when you left, and you say the thing that didn't leave is coming back, what's going on here? So there are little common things in just the parlance of the way that we talk about the stories that we tell one another, that the city used to be empty, that Detroit is coming back, that Black Bottom was a slum. You know, they deny the realities of what has happened, this erasure. And the process is happening even today in even neighborhoods.
That's right.
In which you have landlords that are not caring for various properties, running the people out of them, not caring for the properties at all. People are being run out, and then they will, you know, be triumphant redevelopers, you know, or sell them to other redevelopers, and you'll have an entire new class of people that move in.
Or suppressing the value of the homes that are there now so that they can buy cheap
Right.
and then raise the prices.
Well, I think that that goes to, that's absolutely true, of course, but I think that that goes to a kind of overarching narrative that, I'm going all the way there. We talk often about white flight. I don't like to use the term white flight. I think that that is another narrative that has been constructed in order to, number one, paint a certain picture of what happened here, as if white people just woke up one day and decided, I don't want to live with these black people no more. But it was a much more complex situation than that. And I say that whites were driven from the city. They were driven from the city, even though, yes, some of them did not want to live with us, of course. But they were enticed to leave and not stay and learn to live with us by development across 8 Mile.
Exactly.
Oh, that's right.
And those developers that developed the areas outside 8 Mile have now been there doing that process for some generations. They entice people by making them feel like it's better, it's more cool to live in the suburban areas. You don't want to be in these big old houses in Detroit and all this kind of thing. Today, we see the opposite. The pendulum has swung backward. Now that the city has been appropriately devalued by this movement and everything else, now the developers swing back. And they say, the only cool place to live is downtown Detroit. It's so cool to live in Detroit. And now we want you to come back. So it isn't a subjective thing in which young white people just all of a sudden just, I want to live downtown. No, they're being driven downtown by the subjective narratives, stories that are being told about why to live downtown, why it's cooler to live downtown in Midtown, why you want to live in Detroit instead of the suburbs, because follow the money. So these are just some of the things that I talk and write about. This question of reparation is very complex. It is not an easy one. I will say one last thing, because I've talked way too long. The 1967 rebellion, one of the things you never hear as an underlying cause was the fact that the people of Black Bottom were still enraged about having been forced out of their community. Only 10, 6, 7 years before that.
That's right.
See, we look at this as long stretches of time, Jamon.
That's right.
You know, and then all of a sudden as an adult, I realized, wait a minute.
Same people.
These are the same people that were driven from the Black Bottom area, the Hastings Street area, and then forced to come and live in this west side, this tight west side area.
That's right.
Compelled to, you know. And then and a friend who was an attorney during those days say that up until the 67 rebellion, people were still coming to the city asking for redress, asking for some form of redress, because most people did not own property in Black Bottom and Hastings Street. They were renters, even the business people.
That's right.
Black people couldn't just own homes and properties back then. And so when they had eminent domain and they paid people because they were moving, they didn't pay the people that moved.
That's right.
They paid the owners.
That's right.
And many of the owners that moved, they moved to suburban areas because most of them by that time were suburban anyway. And many of them had very successful businesses built on the back of having had to move from Hastings. Okay, that's enough. Thank you.
And Michelle, if I might add to that, because I have worked in the public sector for many, many years in Washington as well as in Detroit. What can government institutions do to rebuild trust and repair harm done to displaced communities? I believe is my question. Something, and it'll kind of tie into one of the other questions. What is the one action that the audience can take today to support preservation of Black Detroit history? So I am a legislative technician. I'm someone who does the research, writes up, pulls together the legislation, takes it to the member of Congress for them to introduce it. So in those roles, you, the people, come to me. I've heard from Detroiters as well as when I worked for Michigan Senator at that time, which was Donald Regal, who was the senior senator for the state of Michigan. I hear from people from all over the state. And so it is incumbent upon you, us, to ask for and demand what we want in terms of historical preservation. The city of Detroit obviously has its planning commission and the Detroit Historic District Commission that you should be going to those meetings. And if you're not able to get to them in person, you should be demanding that they are virtual, or at least you can listen on the phone while you're on your lunch break if you're working during the day or the evenings, whenever those meetings are being held. But you should also be looking to your federal dollars as well as your state and city dollars to ask for funding to save those spaces, like the Bluebird Inn, right, on Tireman, and other places, not just the historic marker and then erase the building. I don't believe in demolishing a place that may have had a negative memory, such as what we have in Uvalde, Texas. They're destroying or demolishing the school where those children were shot and killed, and other places. I think they need to be there as a reminder of what happened, because people, they learn more visually.
That's right.
So if you can see a place, and it's not, I don't know, it's going in and out. If you can see a place, such as the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was murdered, right? So it fell into disrepair. It was in the throes of becoming demolished. But what happened? Oh, but praise God. Black people stood up and said, no, we don't want this demolished. We want from now until infinity, people to see that balcony and to see what happened here, you know, and walk through, historians like yourself, talk through what was happening there. And so in 1991, because the people around the country, as well as those in Tennessee, stood up and said, we want the Lorraine Hotel to remain, they were able to get it converted into what? The National Civil Rights Museum, using public-private funding, right? And that came to fruition, that was 1991, and became included in the African American Civil Rights Network in March of 2018. It takes a little time, but you gotta learn to write, and it's not hard. You know, basically you just write and say, I want this. We believe based on our research, it will cost this much, and this is our timeline. And there are those of us in the community, or contact your members of Congress or your city council members or your state representatives and ask them to help you write it to those appropriate entities. You've got the National Endowment, the Historic Trust. You got a lot of entities that are preserving what people are asking to be preserved. So you got to, you know, you got to speak up. And so leaning into part of my background, which has been a registered lobbyist before Congress, a hired gun for industry to go and ask for what the industry wants. You, the people, have the power to do that also, and can override someone like me who has money to go up on the Hill and fund things for members of Congress. You know, they say, well, I need a recreation center in my district. You know, that'll help me get reelected. If you're going to vote for what I want, we will pay for that for you, right? That's how it works. So, but you, the people, if you are prevailing upon your legislators at any level, federal, state, county, whichever it is, and saying that you don't want that, or you want this, or you want these buildings to stay,
Phelps Lounge.
Phelps Lounge, all of them, and you need funding to do that, that's what your government money is supposed to be for. But you have to ask for it, you have to demand it, really. And you have to start to learn what the cycles are, the budget cycle, so that you can make your request during that time period. But anyone and everyone can and should be doing that for those things that we want, those spaces that we want preserved, right? And it's not hard, you know, and I moved back to Detroit 5 years ago. And after 30 years in Washington and becoming a Washington insider, being appointed to various positions within the Obama administration and a number of things. And my friends and colleagues asked me, why on earth would you go back to Detroit? Narrative, right? At the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C., there was a ruin, R-U-I-N, porn exhibit. And what was the title project? Detroit. There are people that were going around taking pictures of decayed buildings and dwellings in Detroit. Well, I could show you the same thing in Washington, D.C. I can show you that in New York. I can show you that in San Francisco. It's all over. But people delighted in going to see these old buildings, factories, etc., that have fallen into decay. I hope you will write down a book that will build on what Marcia said. It is by Thomas Sugrue. I think it's S-E-G-R-U-E.
F-U-G.
S-U-G-R-U-E. He published a book in 1996. I bought it and read it back then, titled The Origins of Urban Decline, right?
Origins of urban crisis.
Urban crisis, okay. And he was Wayne State, I think University of Pennsylvania, Harvard. He's a Harvard trained, and he's a native Detroiter. But he talks about the origins of Detroit, the arsenal of democracy. Didn't start with the 1967 rebellion, which is what most people would like to say. It started in the 1940s, right? You got to look at what was economically happening in Detroit. So after World War II, when we were building all those tanks at Chrysler and all of those other defense mechanisms, well, when that started declining, you know, and then you had what I do call it white flight, because that's what did happen. People moved out. And that's when we saw jobs moving out, people moving out, and I'll lean into another role of mine as a trained statistician. I have run the census, the 2010 census in DC, as well as here in 2020, and other surveys throughout the county, Wayne County. We have valuable assets here, but the narrative is that we don't. And so the preservation, what can government do at all levels? You got to ask for the money to preserve spaces and cultural history, like oral histories, so that it is preserved and retained.
And that's what I want to make sure that we have time to, because the time is going. We need questions from you too, because this is the time for questions and answers, because we have this wonderful person here who has actually been in the halls of government and knows how things run. We have people here in the audience who are asking about properties and places that are still existing in Detroit that need to continue to exist. And how do we get these two things together? How do we find the money to keep these things going? So let's start with some questions. Yes.
I would love to. In fact, I was asked last Monday, I went to my council member, Fred Durhall's community meeting, and he started a series on government. I think, know your government. And an elder in the community, she said, you know, but how do we do this or how do we do that? And I said, you know, it's very important for people to know government, the levels, but really what they need to know is how to advocate. How do you impact government? And so I would definitely, you know, love to do that, because that's what I did in Washington. And I taught white men who were captains of industry how to lobby Congress. I actually wrote a book back in the 90s on how to lobby Congress.
But you wrote a book, and where is it?
It was an industry book. I was a lobbyist for the commercial building industry. And so I don't know that it's in print, I'd have to check. I scanned it a few years back, and so I do have a copy of it, digital copy of it. But effectively, we bring people to Washington to teach them how to go on the Hill and lobby for what they wanted. So, but the average folks don't know that. It's not in our curriculums in high school. Even as a political scientist coming out of the University of Michigan, I wasn't taught that. Everything that I learned on the job, I didn't learn it in school. I learned it by doing. And so I would definitely be interested in doing that, because that we need to know how. Organizing, Renard,
Yes.
because you're gonna help that Joy Road bus finally make its way.
We have another question
Right.
over here.
It's organized
That's
is what you need to know how to do.
That's the outside inside part of it as well too. The inside of it is government, but the outside pressure is people.
That's right.
And you do have power. You don't have to be, a big shot or I'm a regular person impacted by an unjust transit system. So I'm there to ensure that and disabled individuals and bus riders are not going to get messed up by this project. So you got to come in where you see yourself in the impact, right? If you believe in preserving the story of majority Black Detroit, you have to organize to that effect too, and have a plan when you go in front of these elected officials. Know the power structure, who's who. That's a power map as well too. That's
it.
That's what is done in the
Know your legislations. We got a question over here, sir.
Kind of. I just wanted to say that, and Miss Music can tell you, she read it the other day. I made a lengthy Instagram post about why I'm here, but I'm going to have to edit it because the two women sitting up here are the reason why I'm here. John Conyers' work and your work is the reason that I came from Minneapolis, Minnesota to attend Wayne State University. What you did and have done is the reason why I'm standing right here. And Miss Music, you and I have had many discussions about why I'm here in real life and in the written word. And I had to choke back the tears. I didn't know that all about your father, about his illness.
That's the story.
But yeah, you two women are the reason that I'm standing where I am right now. And I'm hoping I finally get the gumption I got the petitions. I'm going to attempt to run for United States Senate for this great state. I have no experience and I'm kind of bald and I'm kind of Jewish, but I think that I can do it. And it's thanks to the two of you. So I just wanted to thank you.
Michelle, if I could just build on that, some of the things that Congressman Conyers did, and I worked for him in the early 80s and in the late 80s and 90s, they were some of the cultural bills that we did. He was chairman of House Judiciary, he was chairman of government operations, so we had a lot of things that we were doing. But some of those cultural bills, like in the 80s, we did a bill to create jazz as an American national art form. And a lot of people and his constituents, were wondering, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Because we need to preserve the culture. And what came out of that? Also preserving Duke Ellington's archives, his papers, his writings, his compositions, so that they would be at the Library of Congress and they would be at the American History Museum, part of the Smithsonian. We also did a bill in 1990, tap dance bill, Bill Bojangles Robinson. We did that. A lot of people didn't know, what is that? Because tap dance is an American, we have our Irish counterparts, but we have a great art form here. So a lot of cultural bills that if you enroll them and enshrine them at the congressional federal level, you start getting money at other levels, your foundations, because you're now recognizing on a larger platform. So if there's something, if you liked Rubik's Cubes and you're like a big Rubik's Cube person, that's a skill I don't have. And you want to enshrine that, go to your legislators and get the money to get it recognized on a national and a global level.
We have a question back here. Yes, ma'am.
As much as I like to hear about Black Bottom, I didn't come here today for that. I came here to hear about I-375, how the demolishment of that's going to impact us today. Because the idea of reconnecting is not happening. There's no neighborhood to reconnect. So what are we going to do? How are we going to realize any benefit from 375 being destroyed for some crazy notion of being able to connect to the river? We really can get to the river without having to turn it into a boulevard. What is going people who were removed, such as my family, from Black Bottom, on the promise that we're gonna come back because once we build this house, we are gonna have first life.
I would like to get you on the microphone. I'm so sorry, because that's an important, that's what we're talking about too.
While she's coming to you, I think that you should, if you haven't already, start talking to your city council members, I don't know what district you live in, and put that ask on the table.
I went through it and did the revisioning and all that. My opinion was not bad. Other people in that audience was not bad. You don't know about the public hearings when they come up, so therefore you missed the public. But when you make a point and put it on the what do you call those things? Post-its. I mean, I'll be at the beginning of the 375 back in 2014. So I'm not talking about a recent development. But now we want to get all romantic about reconnecting Black Bottom, Paradise Valley. But you're going to impact the people who live right now, that side of town, off of 375. But we're going to allow Black people to have businesses on this boulevard, on this expanded land. I don't believe it because my family lived through it when they said, we lived on Mullet off of Joseph in Hart. They said, your family can come back once we rebuild Elmwood and all that.
Who said that?
The city, the planning, the planning commission. This is what they, when they went through the neighborhood, ma'am, back in the day. I know what they told my parents. On your birth certificate, if you can prove you were born there, you're supposed to be able to come back. That didn't happen. So now we're saying, okay, 375, we're going to demolish it. We're going to have all this land on either side for development of what? What's the guarantee? All right, so,
so real quick,
my name is Beverly Kinder Walker. I ain't trying to have him, nobody, but I want to know.
I know better. So I want to be clear that this is something that we all kind of need to understand. She gave her family story, but that's a big story of what happened at the area known as Black Bottom. So let's start first, and I'm trying to do this as quickly as I can. The destruction of Black Bottom really begins in 1943. In 1943, there's a race riot in the city of Detroit. After that race riot, the state governor and the Michigan mayor, the Detroit mayor is Edward Jeffries, they both create commissions to study the causes of the race riot. Both commissions blame Black people. Both commissions blame Black people for the race riot. So the plan is to do something to this neighborhood that has the highest concentration of African Americans in the city of Detroit. As Marsha told us, it ain't the only place Black people live, but it's the highest the neighborhood with the highest concentration of African Americans. And so there's something to be done. Eugene Greenhut meets with Edward Jeffries, who's the mayor, saying we can redevelop this area. We can expand the central business district and create a residential neighborhood, redevelop. I've been doing this all over the country. He's done it in New York. And he gets Jeffries' ear. Jeffrey comes up with a Detroit City plan, also known as the Gratiot Redevelopment Plan. He brings it, and it's supposed to be two neighborhoods that are going to be highly destroyed. Black Bottom and Cass Corridor. The Cass Corridor residents and business folks say, you ain't doing that over here. And Jeffries takes Cass Corridor off the table. And only Black Bottom is going to get dealt with. And so he brings it to the city council. The city council approves it in 1946, the destruction of the area that we know as Black Bottom. But the city don't have the money to destroy Black Bottom in 1946. The war has just ended. The city don't have the money for this. It's been a race riot in the city, which caused a lot of damage. But in 1949, the federal government passed the National Housing Act of 1949, also known as the Urban Renewal Act. At this time, there's an election going on, and Albert Cobo is elected mayor. When Albert Cobo is elected mayor, he's running basically on a housing segregation platform. That's basically what he's running. He's not calling it that, but that's basically what he's doing.
He did call it, his platform was on Negro removal.
Yeah, so
he did say that.
So what he's talking about is keeping African Americans out of white neighborhoods, and low income folks, low income development will be stopped. That's what he's running on. He'll win 3 elections. He'll die in office. Now he's the mayor when the federal government gives the money. Now Truman's Fair Deal plan in housing was supposed to do two things. One, urban renewal, destroy the slum, so-called slum clearance, and then bring more money to that same community for working class and low-income people. Cobalt accepts the money to destroy Black Bottom and refuses any federal funds for rebuilding the area to bring Beverly Kendall Walker's family back. Although the city has sent out letters claiming that that's what they're gonna do. So they have sent out letters to all the people, hey, your land is gonna be, you're gonna lose this land, but we're gonna rebuild this community and you'll be able, it'll be facilities, it'll be structures that you'll be able to move back to. But Cobo is having none of that. He refuses to accept any funds. He only will accept private funding. So for about 7 years, Black Bottom is just a wasteland. There's nothing being built because private developers don't want to deal with it, and he's not accepting any public funds to do anything with, which would have built it immediately. Working class people, the majority of Black Bottom are working class, low income, are moved out, and they don't get nothing. Even the owners, even the majority of the owners aren't given what they're due. So even the ones who get something don't get what they ought to have gotten. About 5 major lawsuits end up in federal court because these people are able to fight the city. The city has claimed their land, has said this, we quit this land. You have to give it up, and then the city does nothing. So the city told them, don't build nothing on it, don't reprove your land, don't do nothing. We're gonna give you some money eventually for this land. The people don't do nothing. And then 10 years later, the city says, okay, this house that you have is in violation of this, and this. We're going to take your land unless you fix these things up. Now, you don't want to fix these things up, and the city said they're not going to pay you for the things you fix up. Many of the people who lose their land in Paradise and Black Bottom tear down their own houses. In some cases, the city didn't even demolish it. They tore it down so they could stop being ticketed by the city. And then, a year or two after they tore it down, the city would come to them and say, we want to buy your vacant lot. And so there were 4 lawsuits that will go all the way to federal court. But the other lawsuits, the city would lose and then appeal. Lose, appeal, lose. Those people fall off. They can't keep fighting the city. 4 of them kept going to the 1960s, almost just before the 67 uprising. 4 of those lawsuits, and they all of them won these eminent domain cases. Attorney Ackerman was one of the attorneys for one of these cases. And so what Beverly Kendall Walker is saying is right. They were promised that this was going to be rebuilt at one point. Cobo never wanted that to happen, but prior to him becoming mayor, letters had gone out promising this. They went out and took pictures of the structures. There are people posing those pictures. You saw some of them earlier. There's people posing in pictures. They wouldn't be posing if they thought their house was about to get destroyed, they never gonna come back. They were posing for the pictures because they were being told that this place is about to get fixed up and you're gonna be able to come back once we fix it up. So that's why they posing and they happy because they see Black Bottom is finally about to get its just due. But that ain't what happened. The first structure to get built is the Lafayette Park development. Mies Van der Rohe homes, the Pavilion, the Lafayette Towers, 1300 Lafayette. None of those working class folks from Black Bottom could afford to come back in any of those structures. They can't afford to come back there. That's the first area of Black Bottom to be rebuilt. And then in the middle of Black Bottom's destruction, the federal government passed the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. I want you to be clear. The building of the freeway didn't destroy Black Bottom. Black Bottom was almost all destroyed before the freeway is built. The freeway destroyed the last vestige of Black Bottom, Hastings Street. The residential area, for the most part, had already been destroyed by Cobo. Now, they're building the freeway through Hastings Street. And Hastings Street seals the end of Black Bottom and begins the foray into destroying Paradise Valley. And so now you got this freeway. And I want you to be clear about this freeway because we talk about Hastings Street. The freeway destroys Hastings Street, but the freeway is expansive more than Hastings Street. It's cutting off all of those other streets that run into Hastings Street. So don't just think Hastings Street, Lafayette, Larned, Monroe, Mullet, Macomb, all those streets are also shortened by the freeway, all the way down to Mack, Forest, Alexandrine, Warren, all those streets are cut. So you lost not only the main street, Hastings, you've lost all the businesses for about a block and on one side and a half a block on the other side. You've lost those businesses too because of the building of that freeway. So now the Michigan Department of Transportation, of course, is going to, and I'm gonna be clear, they're gonna do it. They're gonna rebuild that and make that a street and make that a surface street. That's their plan. They're going to do it. What has to be done now is that the people have to say that we have to have a stake in this. Now, the first thing that's different from this time is that they didn't even talk to the community before. They sent you a letter saying we taking your land. You need to do da 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 da. There wasn't no meetings. So the first thing is that they are at least listening to people. Now, what we have to do in that listening, we have to make some demands of what's going to happen. This has got to happen in this case, or it's not going to go like you want it to go. All right?
The demands have to be concrete.
And they have to be concrete demands because they're going to build this. It's going to be a boulevard instead of 375. That's going to happen.
I want to add to what Baba Jaman said about some actions and then transition us to close with the panelists just sharing one action item that people could take. So Baba Jaman mentioned these community meetings that are happening. Black Bottom Archives is a part of that. Detroit People's Platform is a part of that. Baba Jaman has been present in those conversations. And there are other folks present that are coming with an agenda of wanting to make sure that reparations are taken seriously and that we're advocating for community demands that are supporting the majority Black Detroit that often gets left out of this. And so a part of that, I mean, we brought it up in the first local advisory committee meeting about what does it mean for us to consider reparations? And the response that we got is that, like has been mentioned, is that a lot of folks who were displaced were renters, and that there's limited documentation of those folks. And so therefore, we were almost kind of told that it's an impossible situation. And what we know is that that's not true. We talk about memories and history, but folks who were displaced are still alive. Their descendants are still alive. And there is power in the stories that we tell. The lack of documentation of that community is intentional. The lack of documentation allows for those folks to be ignored and be erased. But our stories have power. So, I mean, one way to tell stories or to be able to argue the value of what was lost is to look at these records. Another way is for folks to be sharing their stories, either them directly experiencing it, stories that they heard from elders who are part of that community. And so Black Bottom Archives is interested and has been doing oral history collection for almost 10 years now. And we've been doing that because there is an importance in preserving Black Detroiters' history. Right, Black Bottom is one area, but there's Black Detroit history being created everywhere. And so it's important to us to preserve that history. But I think especially in this moment, there's a political power that our stories have for us to be able to advocate for us to get just reparations in this case. And so I think one action item is that if you have a story about Black Bottom, to connect with us, and we would love to be able to document that story. And then I think generally just moving with this belief that we all have histories that are worth preserving is that you also step up as an active role of documenting your own history, of documenting your community's history, because whether that work is funded by state dollars, city dollars, or federal dollars, that's work that still has to be done, and we have to be active participants. I see your question, but I want us to close out so we can.
I want to say one last thing. I know it's time, but I want to say one last thing. Marcia said it was purposeful. In 1954, the Detroit Housing Commission, 3 members were protesting against Cobo's plans for Black Bottom. They were against it. They would end up resigning, and he would replace them with private developers. But they were protesting. So it gets to the federal government. The federal government demands Cobo to keep records so that the people who have not been compensated could be compensated, and the people, even renters, could be helped by federal funds by keeping these records. Cobo would destroy the records, have the records destroyed, and tell his workers to stop keeping records so that the federal government can't come back to the city and say, okay, we want the people who were displaced, and they are entitled to certain kinds of assistance. COBO will have those destroyed. It's purposeful what ends up happening. COBO is purposely trying to make sure that that these Black folks are basically wiped out of the city. That's his plan. He dies in office. That's his plan. He's even going further than what Edward Jeffries was going to do. So even though Edward Jeffries started the plan, it's more than likely that Edward Jeffries would have accepted that federal money to build new structures in Black Bottom. COBO turns even federal money down to build new structures. He goes even further and he wipes out the records. So the reason why we have why Black Bottom Archives is so important is because some of these records don't exist, and it gives the state and everybody else the excuse to not, hey, we don't have these records. Well, COBO destroyed them. That's why you don't have them. And he stopped keeping records. But the other thing is we have these archives. We have people who have stories like Beverly's Kendall Walker's story, like Mama Marsha's story, and like so many other stories who can tell what happened to their family, to their family's businesses, to their family's cultural institutions. That can happen, and that will be what we will have to focus on to make sure that some kind of restitution is made.
I want to speak directly to what Ms. Walker raised. I too went to all of those meetings that were held in the Lafayette Park community. Most of them were held at the Eastern Market, in which they had focus groups and the federal agencies or state agencies that were responsible for this studying the rebuilding of the I-75, the deconstruction of 75 and the rebuilding of it. I always called it a dog and pony show because I felt like they already had an agenda about what they wanted to do, and it was a matter of just trying to figure out how they were going to do that with the least community resistance possible. I did notice that over time, their narrative changed. You see, we talk about narratives. The narrative began to talk about how the change for I-75 was going to be to right wrongs. This was not a part of the original narrative when we went to these meetings.
That's right.
And
Give her your mic.
thank you. And I went to, and I speak a lot about Black Bottom and all of these things, you know. And I noticed that when I'm interviewed, I was interviewed by MSNBC, I was interviewed during this period of time by other networks. They would always parrot the information that they had gotten.
Right.
And they would say, so Marcia, tell us about how in this situation that you experienced with your father, how this new I-75 is going to right the wrongs. Okay? And some of them even would parrot my own words back to me as if they had been studying what is being said about the entire history and using that as a part of their narrative. I will say this. The bottom line is, Ms. Walker, is that this is an issue not of righting wrongs per se. It is an issue of developers.
Right.
Again.
Yes.
That is why I talked about developers earlier, because we are talking about the redevelopment and the developers who are lined up in order to capitalize, monetize that now strip of land that's going to be about a mile long or however long it's going to be. And that is the primary impetus behind what they're doing.
That's right.
And so the things that Ms. Hazel is talking about are very important as far as how the community engages itself with it's asserting itself as far as what is wanted. But let's all be clear that you have to follow the money when it comes down to this and not the narrative.
That's right.
Well, I appreciate y'all sticking through This has been an amazing panel, and I just want to make sure we can give a round of applause to all of our panelists. This is a start to this conversation, so this isn't the end all be all way for folks to be engaged in this type of conversation. And so I want to encourage you to connect with each other, to connect with the panelists here. If you're interested in preserving an oral history, I mean, also getting informed and involved with the work that DSC is doing. And yeah, I think also keeping up with the Reparations Task Force and how important their role is going to be throughout this period of time and beyond. But again, thank you all so much for joining us for this panel, and excited to continue to be in conversation with y'all about archiving, storytelling, and how we can be pushing back against agendas that aren't rooted in protecting our communities. Thank y'all. On.
Before everyone leaves, I want to do one commercial. Before everyone leaves, I wanted to just do a commercial for one of Detroit's legendary groups, Motown Group, which is Detroit Spinners. And I heard when I walked in, two people over here singing one of their songs, Sadie. They are up for induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They were a Motown group. They were the Detroit Spinners, and then they went on. But if you are at all interested, the Spinners are being considered for induction. The originals, which all of them are deceased except for one, Henry Fanbo, which is a family friend of mine, church member. Please contact the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You can vote until April 28th. And you would just go to, you could Google it, or you could go to Rock and Roll Hall of Fame website. It's vote.rockhall.com/en if you're interested. Once again, preserving history. They really want it, and so you can help in that capacity.
Thank you all.
This was the last black enclave on the face of the United States. Wow. That's a lot.